As it becomes more difficult for us to make our way through life without leaving behind a trail of physical and digital footprints, it has in turn become far easier for law enforcement agencies to trace the victims of fatal crimes. And yet instances persist where human remains are discovered which are frustratingly never identified. This week, we examine just such an instance, that of the body found in Boiler Stack 9. The faint, persistent buzz of the alarm signal emanating from the control panel situated not far from where he was dozing was sufficient to wake Roy Harris from the brief nap he had been enjoying. Glancing down at his wristwatch, the technician was dismayed to see it was only 5:15, which meant his night shift still had a good 90 minutes left to run before he could even consider heading home to bed. Rising from his chair, Harris stretched out for a moment, before sauntering across to the sprawling array of buttons and switches to see what the mill's safety control systems had detected. In addition to the sharp buzzing sound, a solitary tiny red light was now illuminated, indicating that whatever the fault was, it related to boiler number 9 over on the far side of the facility. Cancelling the alarm, Roy paused to consider his options. Number 9 was a backup boiler stack, which meant it could easily be taken offline and left with a note for his replacement to have a look at after he came on duty. But at the same time, Harris had precious little else to do at this hour of the morning, so a trip across the mill to diagnose the problem and then back again would successfully kill off the remainder of his shift. After a quick diversion to tell his shift supervisor where he was going, the bleary-eyed technician started to walk through the mill to the opposite side where the boiler stacks were all located. He exchanged pleasantries with some of the other workers as he passed by, sharing the usual observations and jokes that came with the dying hours of their night shift. Having eventually made his way to the mill's steam plant, he passed a series of elevated metal boxes until he finally arrived at boiler number 9. From the outside, all appeared in working order, with no obvious steam or water leaks. A quick check of the service hatch at the base of the structure confirmed it was still rusted firmly shut, and so with a shrug of the shoulders, Roy began to climb the metal steps welded to the exterior. Fishing a torch from his pocket, he stepped onto the top of the boiler and opened up the main hatch. He instinctively moved back as a cloud of superheated steam blasted out from the opening, before turning on his torch and directing its beam down into the stack. To his horror, a pair of charred and empty eye sockets leered back up at him from the darkness, forcing the hapless technician to immediately stumble backwards, crying out in fear. As he ran to find help, he could not shake the image of the badly burned and broken body he had just glimpsed, a sight that would haunt his dreams for many years to come. Thank you to BetterHelp for this paid partnership. It's now 2025, and like with every new year, it's become tradition to impose upon ourselves immediate and dramatic changes in the form of New Year's resolutions. We make them, we're expected to stick to them, turn over a new leaf, and hopefully everything works out. But for me personally, I've always found this time of year incredibly stressful. It's never easy to address your problems or bad habits, but it is easy to feel stuck in your current situation or to feel anxiety about falling behind in life. Although I've found, as many have, that therapy can really help break down these vague feelings of being behind into specific, addressable concerns. A qualified therapist can help you develop a personalised timeline that feels authentic rather than socially imposed, so you can develop tools to measure progress on your own terms. The new year becomes this blank space for you to write a new story, and BetterHelp makes it easier to get started. Fill out an online questionnaire and you'll match with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. You'll connect with a therapist online from their diverse network of credentialed professionals with a wide range of specialities and backgrounds. And you can easily switch therapists anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Start fresh any day of the year with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/bedtime stories to get 10% off your first month of therapy. The Bellingham police officers who responded to Roy Harris's frantic emergency call from the Georgia Pacific watermill on the morning of September the 20th, 1987, immediately sealed off the building and called for detectives to attend the scene. Upon their arrival, the investigators were led through a maze of machinery rooms and corridors until they arrived at the mill's steam plant. Each of the facility's steam boilers consisted of a 20-foot tall metal box raised up from the ground on metal stilts and then secured to the adjoining wall. They had all been turned off prior to police arrival, but the ambient temperature in the room still remained at a balmy 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees C as the investigators stripped off their suit jackets and climbed up the metal rungs to reach the roof of one of these structures. The insides of the boilers were crammed full of high-pressure steam pipes of varying lengths and thicknesses, all of which crisscrossed one another to form a series of lattice configurations. At the base of the enclosed space, reclined across a collection of pipes that were raised just off the floor, lay the carbonized and skeletal remains of a human body. As the uniformed officers at the base of the boiler began to try and force open the service hatch, a task that would frustratingly take a further 2 hours, the detectives began to make notes on what they could see down below. The dimensions of the body suggested it was an adult male of slim build, who had clearly sustained multiple fractures to both his upper and lower limbs. The dead man was wearing the tattered remains of a denim jacket, jeans, and a pair of trainers, in sharp contrast to the safety overalls and the steel toe-cap boots of the workers that stood nearby, watching what was taking place. Several strips of material had been torn from various points across the clothes, which appeared to have then been used to bind injuries and to act as heat shielding over the man's palms in an apparent failed attempt to maneuver around or climb out of the boiler. The realization that the deceased must have been alive for some time, lying wounded before being burned alive by the searing temperatures of the pipes he was resting on, turned the stomach of more than one of the assembled witnesses. When the body was finally recovered and sent on its way to the Whatcom County Medical Examiner, the investigators then turned their attention to the boiler room's access points. When the mill had initially been constructed during the 1930s, it had only needed 2 boilers, but as the site gradually expanded over the following decades, this number had subsequently been increased to 10. Under normal operating conditions, temperatures inside these structures could increase up to over 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 177 degrees Celsius, a factor which meant that employees rarely attended the room unless absolutely necessary. There were only 2 possible ways to gain access to each boiler: through a small service entry point situated at the base, or a larger hatch which was built into the roof. This was no mean feat, accessible only by climbing up vertical rungs welded to the side of the structure or dropping down from a narrow metal catwalk which ran the length of the boiler room. With the service hatch clearly rusted shut due to lack of use, it was evident that the victim must have entered the boiler via the main hatch. But this in itself would have been problematic. Having been targeted in the past by environmental saboteurs, the mill was surrounded by metal fencing with security guards employed. The workers on the site were all long-term employees who knew each other well, and any new face would have been instantly recognizable. Due to the severely burned and degraded condition of the remains, it proved impossible for the coroner to determine the presence of drugs or alcohol within the body, or to recover any viable DNA. In his report, He estimated that the deceased was aged between 25 to 35 years old, of average height and weight, with evidence of having undergone extensive dental work in the past. Though unable to determine an exact time of death, it was believed that the victim had died at some point during the week prior to his discovery. The boiler was only occasionally in use, having last been fired up on the morning of the 17th of September for several hours, which was 3 days before the internal alarm signal had been triggered. In addition to broken bones in both of his legs, there was significant damage to the man's right arm, prompting investigators to speculate that he had sustained these injuries as a result of falling into the boiler's interior. The deceased had no personal possessions on him other than the remains of what appeared to be an airline ticket. However, this was so badly burned that it proved impossible for officers to conduct any further inquiries into it. Searches of the streets near to the mill did not locate any unattended or suspicious vehicles that could be linked to the victim, and as the days turned into weeks, the missing persons report which officers had been waiting for never materialised. Despite numerous press appeals, including the use of facial reconstruction, not one witness ever came forward to identify the body, leaving its presence a complete mystery to this day. With the watermill having closed down in 2006 and since fallen into a state of complete disrepair, further evidence relating to the identity of the body that was found in Boiler Stack 9 is unlikely to be forthcoming. The Bellingham police have long since discontinued their investigations into the case, with the man's remains having been cremated and buried in a local memorial park alongside the bodies of others for whom a traditional burial could not be provided. Over the decades that have passed, the enigma of the unidentified body found lying in a secured boiler stack has occasionally been revisited by media outlets and internet forums. There are several working hypotheses for how the dead man came to die in such an inaccessible place, and yet, even though these are both realistic and viable in their assertions, the question remains as to why no friends or relatives have ever come forward to identify the cadaver or to report their loved one missing. The first, and perhaps arguably the most likely explanation, is that the dead man was an environmental protester. Having managed to jump the fence and avoid the patrolling guards, and with no security cameras on site to worry about, the man had made his way to the boilers in the hope of sabotaging them. Not only would this have brought operations at the mill to a halt, but would also attract media attention to the waste products being jettisoned into the nearby waterfront area. Unfortunately for the saboteur, his mission would ultimately prove not only unsuccessful, but also fatal. Whether falling into the boiler due to his own misadventure, or potentially being encountered on site and deliberately pushed in by an employee, any initial concerns he may have had about his discovery may soon have been replaced by the horror of a gruesome and inevitable fate. In this scenario, it is possible that any associates of the victim would have been reluctant to come forward due to fear of prosecution from the authorities. They may have been keen to avoid their organisation and the identities of its members from becoming public knowledge, remaining silent in order to keep their secret from their friends and families. Whilst extensive efforts were made locally to try and clarify the victim's identity, if he was a member of a national protest group and from another state, then it's possible that any filed missing persons report would not have come to the attention of the investigating officers. His relatives, therefore, may also have never learned of the tragic and mysterious incident which had taken place far away in Bellingham. The mystery around how the male came to be inside the premises carrying no form of identification on his person does strongly suggest that he was there of his own volition, with some form of deliberate intent. If this was not sabotage, then the possibility remains that this was an act of suicide, with the victim fully aware of how dangerous the internal workings of the boiler could prove to be. The fact that the searing conditions inside the boiler stack could ravage the man's remains to the point where they were impossible to identify may have been a very deliberate part of his plan, meaning that his loved ones would most likely never know the painful details surrounding his demise. However, it does seem like a terrible way to go, and this also means that the victim must have been in possession of some form of detailed knowledge of the plant's layout, as well as the internal workings of the boiler. The identities of all current and former employees at the site were checked by the investigating officers working on the case, and so any potential disappearance amongst the workforce should therefore have been picked up on. Consequently, this opens up the possibility that the body was that of a victim of serious crime and that they had been disposed of by someone with intimate knowledge of the facility. Had an employee of the watermill either committed a murder or suddenly needed to dispose of a witness to a crime they had perpetrated? Did they manage to smuggle the victim onto the site, throwing them into the boiler knowing they could not survive and that the heat would destroy their identity? Another alternative is that this was some sort of prank or urban exploration gone wrong. During a search of the boiler, the carbonized remains of tools were found lying on the floor, but these were discounted from the investigation as their age could not be dated. Potentially, the male was part of a larger group, which panicked and fled when he fell, their guilt never allowing them to come forward and reveal the truth about the tragedy. This scenario was examined by local papers in 2006, when an employee of a neighbouring factory unit revealed that youths from out of the area would visit the location in order to clamber up onto the roofs of the facilities, where they would hold running and climbing races. Sometimes they would persuade or bribe the guards to allow them to do this, and he had heard that the dead man was a teenager from New York who had been left to die by his friends. The final theory about how the man may have voluntarily come to die inside the boiler is that they were suffering from mental health issues. In 2006, a steam engineer at the nearby Western Washington University named Richard Severson came forward to describe how in the same year that the incident took place, he had been guiding a tour around the university when one of the guests had become fixated by the boilers. This visitor, a female in her 30s, had pushed past him and clambered into an inactive boiler. After several efforts to remove her, eventually security guards had to be called for, and she was ejected from the campus. It was believed she had been suffering from some form of breakdown and may have been the victim of boiler stack number 9, only for authorities to discount the incident as the body was clearly that of a male. The possibility remains that after nearly 40 years, there is somebody still alive who knows the identity of the unknown man. By keeping this story in the public eye, we hope that this may prompt them to come forward before it's too late for them to do so, and to give the victim's family the closure they deserve.